The moment the carriage curtains opened, my spirit slipped inside along with Song-soo. The princess sat opposite him, her face twisted in disgust, as she glared at the severed head he carried. "You agreed to come back to my estate," she sneered. "Why are you still holding on to that filthy thing?" Song-soo smiled gently. "Yun-yang was once my wife. It's only right that I see her off properly." The princess froze for a moment, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "Are you blaming me for killing her?" "I wouldn't dare." Song-soo shook his head, his expression calm. "I'm only concerned that, without a proper burial, her soul might linger in this world, unable to find peace." I ground my teeth in fury. "You wretched man, I just died, and you're already pandering to her." But my anger was useless. The princess, instead of being upset, seemed pleased. With a wave of her delicate hand, she declared, "Fine, I'll escort you out of the city so you can bury her. Afterward, you'll devote yourself to serving me." Song-soo obediently lowered his gaze and replied, "As you wish." I kicked him hard, but my ghostly foot passed right through his body. That's when it hit me. I was already dead. Still, I decided to let it slide, since he was, at the very least, taking care of my remains. My body had long been burned to ashes, leaving only my head behind. Once Song-soo buried it, I'd finally be able to reincarnate. Yet, as I thought about how little time we'd truly spent together, and how final this parting was, I couldn't help but feel reluctant. It wasn't that I was overly sentimental. It was just that Song-soo was devastatingly handsome. Floating closer to him, I rested my head lightly on his shoulder, gazing at his chiseled profile with a bittersweet longing. He seemed to sense something, tilting his head slightly, his lips brushing against my forehead. The carriage arrived at a bamboo grove on the outskirts of the city. Song-soo stepped out with my head cradled in his arms. The princess lazily drew back the curtains and urged, "Hurry up." I stuck my tongue out at her. "Horrible woman, if I didn't want to reincarnate, I'd turn into a vengeful ghost and scare you to death." Song-soo entered the grove, carefully placing my head on a piece of cloth torn from his robe. Staring at the bloodied, disheveled head, I muttered in exasperation, "You couldn't even clean it up. How undignified for a burial." He couldn't hear me, of course, and began digging a grave with his bare hands. Soon, his hands were red and raw. "Idiot," I grumbled, stamping my ghostly foot on the knife lying nearby. "You have a perfectly good tool right there." But he ignored it, digging deeper and deeper with his hands. When the grave was ready, he picked up my head, gently combing through my matted hair, smoothing the tangles one by one. As he worked, he whispered, "Yun-yang, tell me, how did she kill you?" I rolled my eyes. "If you have the guts, ask the princess yourself. What's the point of questioning my head?" He didn't respond, instead carefully arranging my hair, pressing a kiss to my lifeless lips. "Yun-yang, you've suffered." I kicked him again. "Oh, please, you're about to marry my killer, and still have the nerve to act heartbroken." He didn't notice, placing his jade pendant on my forehead, then wrapping my head in the cloth, gently lowering it into the grave. Layer after layer of dirt covered me, until the burial was complete. Without looking back, Song-soo walked out of the grove. I watched him leave, silently bidding him farewell. But before I could drift away, an invisible force yanked me back to his side. Confused, I glanced at the simple dirt mound that marked my grave. "What's going on?" "Wait, I'm already a ghost." I tried again to leave, but the same force pulled me back. As I racked my brain, a thought struck me. It wasn't the usual attachment of a spirit with unfinished business. Song-soo was already with the princess. What more could I want? Then my eyes fell on the mound. A headstone. That's it. I don't have a proper headstone. Furious, I floated back to Song-soo, who was now seated in the princess's carriage. The princess leaned on him, laughing sweetly, her hands trailing over his arm. He didn't resist, letting her do as she pleased. I fumed, perching atop the carriage. As we passed Song Manor, two familiar figures, kneeling at the gates, caught my attention. "Give me back my daughter." "Give her back," my parents wailed, their voices raw with anguish. My heart twisted as I reached out to console them, but my hands passed right through their bodies. Just then, the carriage halted. The princess peeked out, coldly commanding, "Drag them away." and execute them. I froze, desperation surging as I hurled insults at the princess. Suddenly, my body began to heat up, the warning signs of transforming into a vengeful ghost. If I gave in, I'd lose my chance at reincarnation forever. But to save my parents, I was willing to sacrifice everything. Before I could act, Song Su's calm voice broke through. Your Highness, this is our wedding day. Why mar it with unnecessary bloodshed? The princess, appeased, leaned back languidly. What do you suggest? Exile them from the city, banish them forever. He replied, his tone steady. She waved a hand dismissively. Fine, make it quick. Song Su approached my parents, their grief overflowing into anger. They launched themselves at him, their fists pounding his chest. You heartless man! Give us back our daughter. He stood there silently, head bowed, letting their blows fall without resistance. When I first met Song Su, I was just a village girl. The Song family, minor officials in the capital, would never have considered someone like me. Under normal circumstances, our paths should never have crossed, but fate had other plans. He was traveling in the mountains for leisure, while I was there gathering herbs for my mother. One careless step sent him tumbling down a rocky cliff, injuring his leg. By chance, I found him. I treated his wounds with herbs, and gave him my only flatbread for sustenance. It was my entire day's ration. But I stubbornly insisted I wasn't hungry. How could I not, when he was so strikingly handsome? Later, I carried him down the mountain and left him at a clinic. I thought it was just a fleeting encounter, but not long after, he showed up at my home with a marriage proposal. My parents, believing our families weren't a good match, firmly refused. So, he knelt at our gate with the betrothal gifts, staying there for an entire day and night. Fearing he might harm himself, my parents hurried to ask for my opinion. Blushing furiously, I nodded, my mind filled with the image of his beautiful face. And just like that, we were married. Our married life was sweet, but the happiness didn't last long. A few months later, war broke out at the border, and he was conscripted. He was gone for 3 years. When the army returned victorious, I spotted him in the distance, riding on horseback, full of vigor but looking unfamiliar. I feared he might have forgotten me. Yet, the moment he saw me, he dismounted and ran straight into my arms, holding me tightly. He told me he had earned military honors, that the emperor would surely promote him, and that he wanted to build a new home, to bring my parents to the city, so we could all live a better life together. Hearing his promises, I was moved to tears. But not long after he returned to the capital, the princess took a liking to him. She publicly requested the emperor's blessing for their marriage. He reassured me that he had refused her outright, and that the emperor had not approved. Yet, that night, he couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as he held me, repeatedly saying that I must stay by his side. I thought he was simply worn out from his time at war, so I comforted him and went out the next morning to buy calming herbs. But as soon as I stepped outside, the princess had me killed in the street. Now a wandering spirit, I hovered beside Song Su, watching as he stood outside the Song estate with his head lowered. My parents beat him and cursed him, but he remained silent. Finally, when they were too weak to continue, they collapsed to the ground, sobbing. He arranged for them to be sent away in a carriage, and whispered something to the servants that I couldn't catch. As the carriage disappeared into the distance, that same invisible force yanked my soul back to his side. I stared at the carriage as it faded from view, my heart heavy with sorrow. Life in the countryside had been hard but filled with warmth. My parents spared no effort to give me the best of what little we had. The villagers often urged them to have a son, but they always said having me was enough. How could they possibly bear losing me now? I thought about their grief and grew angrier. You heartless man, I should have let you die at the bottom of that cliff. But of course, Song Su couldn't hear me. He only gazed toward the city gates, his expression unreadable. When night fell, Song Su entered the princess's residence. The mansion was extravagant, easily 10 times the size of the Song estate. I thought he might be dazzled by its splendor, but his face remained calm, even distant. The princess clung to his arm, pouting. What's wrong? Don't you seem unhappy, Your Highness? He replied softly. I just returned to the capital yesterday, and am feeling a bit fatigued. Besides, we aren't yet officially engaged. It seems improper to move into your estate so soon." The princess laughed and linked her arm through his. "What does it matter? I've already spoken to my father, and he'll issue the marriage decree tomorrow. Soon we'll be married in every sense." My heart sank. So, the princess and the emperor had planned this all along. She had killed me knowing full well I was his wife. And the emperor, despite knowing this, had indulged her. Song-su, was it really worth fighting for such a ruler for 3 years? Yet he didn't seem surprised. His hands curled into fists, his knuckles turning white. That night, Song-su stayed in the guest room of the princess's mansion. The lights remained on. I floated to the window, curious to see what he was doing, and was startled to find him staring directly in my direction. I froze. He gazed at me for a long time, before murmuring, "The moon is so bright tonight." I stood there, stunned, remembering the promise we made before he left for war, to look at the same moon, no matter how far apart we were. Now, we weren't separated by distance, but by life and death. My chest tightened with grief. "Yun-yang," he said suddenly, breaking my reverie. "Do you think the princess is beautiful?" Furious, I stomped my ghostly foot. "How dare you? Have you forgotten she killed me?" But he couldn't hear me, and continued murmuring, "Do you like her face?" I scoffed. "Even if she were the most beautiful woman in the world, her heart is rotten to the core. How could anyone like her?" But then a darker thought crept in. What if one day she tires of you, and kills you as she killed me? To my shock, Song-su smiled faintly. "Yun-yang, how about I give her face to you? Would you like that?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, carrying a chilling undertone. I stared at him, unable to speak, a strange unease blooming in my chest. I widened my eyes in shock. "You can see me." Before the words fully left my mouth, a piercing scream echoed from the neighboring courtyard, cutting me off. It came from the princess's quarters. Song-su's expression darkened immediately, and he dashed toward the sound, running straight through my spectral form. Stunned for a moment, I quickly followed him. When I entered the courtyard, the scene before me froze me in place. The princess sat trembling on the ground, her hair disheveled, her thin robe barely clinging to her. Surrounding her was a mass of figures, only they weren't people. They were ghosts. Each ghost was different, yet all shared an air of tragedy. Some were in tattered clothing, others had missing limbs, and a few bore deep, gaping wounds. They snarled and clawed, inching closer to the princess, as though intent on exacting vengeance. "Ghosts! Ghosts!" the princess screamed, clutching her head in terror. Song-su, on the other hand, remained composed. He walked calmly through the throng of spirits, and to my astonishment, the ghosts parted for him, as though he carried a plague. He knelt beside the princess, helping her up with gentle hands. "Your Highness, what's wrong?" he asked softly. "Ghosts," she stammered, pointing wildly around her. "They're everywhere, can't you see them?" Song-su's gaze swept across the courtyard, his expression calm and unperturbed. "Your Highness, there's no one here but the two of us." I stood frozen, baffled. He couldn't see the ghosts, but just last night, he had spoken to me, looking directly in my direction. What was going on? And why did the ghosts avoid him? The princess voiced my thoughts. "Why are the ghosts afraid of you?" Song-su lowered his head in thought, then reached into his waistband, and pulled out a small red pouch. "Perhaps because of this," he murmured. The princess snatched it from him. "What is it?" she demanded. "Talisman," he replied calmly, as though it were nothing of importance. "Sorcerer from the western regions gave it to me during the war, saying it would ward off ghosts." My chest tightened at his words. The hardships he must have endured in the borderlands, so much so that he needed a talisman for protection, were more than I could bear to think about. The princess toyed with the pouch, scoffing. "If it's so effective, then I'll take it." Song-su offered her a warm smile, his tone indulgent. "If your highness wants it, it's yours. Everything I have belongs to you." His words, spoken with such gentleness, sent a sharp pang through my heart. The princess gestured toward the ghosts, her voice sharp with anger. "Tomorrow, I'll summon a sorcerer to get rid of them all." Song-su lowered his voice, speaking as if to caution her. "I fear this small talisman won't last until tomorrow, Your Highness. Panic flashed in the princess's eyes. Then what should we do? I've learned a bit of ghost banishing myself, he said, his voice soothing. Perhaps I could try. With her approval, Song Su began drawing talismans. I leaned closer to observe, half curious, half worried. Could he really know how to do this? And if he does, would he banish me along with the others? Before I could dwell on the thought, he held up the talisman and began chanting. A brilliant blue light enveloped the princess. They're gone. They're all gone, the princess exclaimed, her voice filled with relief. I glanced at the ghosts. Not a single one had moved. They stood silently in the shadows, untouched by the spell. Frowning, I realized Song Su was deceiving her. That night, the ghosts whispered to me about their deaths. One had been killed for blocking the princess's carriage, another for wearing a color she disliked, and yet another because they had bought a sugar-coated hawthorn for their child. Each tale was a wound that cut deeper into my heart. Why are you only frightening her now? I asked softly. She used to be surrounded by a protective barrier, a pale young woman explained. We couldn't get close, but the man broke it. My breath caught. Song Su, why would he break her barrier? And why lie about exorcising the ghosts? The next morning, the emperor personally visited the princess's estate to deliver an edict. The wedding was to be postponed due to the princess's health, and Song Su was ordered to return to the Song estate to wait. The princess, in a fit of rage, commanded her guards to hunt down my parents and kill them. Furious, I screamed at Song Su, "Stop her!" But he remained emotionless, saying coldly, "If that's what Her Highness wishes, then let it be done." In that moment, the last shred of hope I had for him shattered. My rage boiled over, and my soul began to heat, signs that I was transforming into a vengeful ghost. Just as I prepared to act, Song Su raised his hand and gently waved it through the air. Chilling numbness spread through me, and everything went black. Can ghosts faint? I instinctively reached for my head, only to have my fingers pass right through. That's when I remembered. I was nothing more than a wandering spirit. No body, no head, no nothing. Before I could make sense of my confusion, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside. The princess entered, her arm linked with that of a stern-faced middle-aged man. Before I could get a good look at him, Song Su knelt gracefully, his voice steady and respectful. "This humble servant greets your majesty." So, this was the legendary emperor. Why was he here at the princess's estate? How long had I been unconscious? And worst of all, had my parents already met their end? A flood of questions swirled in my mind, but I chose to stay silent, watching the scene unfold. The emperor seated himself at the head of the hall, his expression as cold as ice. The princess nestled close to him, her voice soft and pleading. "Father, your daughter's health has improved greatly. Please, won't you approve my marriage?" Tears glistened in her eyes, her face a picture of frail beauty. Had I not witnessed her cruelty firsthand, I might have been deceived. The emperor's gaze remained hard. "You're determined to make him your husband?" "Father," the princess sniffled, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your daughter truly loves Song Su. He even took care of the ghostly disturbances in my estate, and nursed me back to health." Her words, accompanied by delicate sobs, painted a picture of selfless devotion. The emperor's expression didn't soften. "What he can do, my sorcerers can do as well." My heart skipped a beat. The emperor had sorcerers? That explained the princess's ghost-repelling barrier. It must have been their work. But if the sorcerers were so skilled, why hadn't they simply eradicated the ghosts haunting the estate? Then it hit me. The princess's hands were drenched in innocent blood, her victims too numerous to count. The ghosts would keep coming, no matter how many were destroyed. A barrier was a more practical solution, one that spared the effort of constant purging. But why had the barrier failed so suddenly? My eyes shifted to Song Su, who knelt silently. Was it his doing? The emperor and the princess went back and forth, her gentle coaxing wearing down his resolve. Song Su, ever the picture of obedience, kept his head bowed, saying nothing. Finally, the emperor relented, leaving behind a marriage decree before departing. The princess beamed with joy, her smile radiant, as she and Song Su knelt to express their gratitude. Song Su's face, however, remained impassive, devoid of any emotion, as though the entire exchange had been meaningless to him. Watching him, my heart twinged painfully. This was the man I had once loved so deeply. Now, he was a stranger. I could no longer understand. I suddenly recalled the day Song Su knelt outside my house to propose. He hadn't eaten or drunk anything for an entire night, waiting for my parents to relent. When they finally agreed, he jumped up in delight, only to grow dizzy from hunger, and topple face first into the dirt. I held back my laughter as I watched his clumsy fall, but inside, my heart brimmed with sweetness. Song Su, I thought, even when you stumble, you're still the most handsome man I've ever seen. How wonderful it was that someone so beautiful was now mine. Though this happiness proved far too short-lived, the princess accepted the marriage decree with undisguised joy, her gaze fixed on Song Su. He smiled in return, but I could see the unease lurking behind that expression. Song Su was always self-assured, yet I had only seen him wear such a worried look twice before. Once when he learned he was to be conscripted, and once more the night he returned from the palace. The decree set the wedding date for 3 days later. The princess's estate was immediately bustling with preparations. The emperor sent a throng of attendants to assist, and the estate was soon adorned with lavish decorations. Though the princess's health had improved, she remained easily fatigued, spending much of her time resting, while servants handled the rest. Song Su stayed quietly by her side, seemingly content with a picture book in hand. But my heart couldn't settle. I still didn't know what had become of my parents. Over the past 2 days, I had tried to gather enough resentment to transform into a vengeful ghost, but the anger would dissipate as quickly as it came, leaving me powerless. I couldn't avenge myself, nor could I protect my parents. Even as a ghost, I felt utterly useless. I spent my days wandering aimlessly, sighing in frustration. Song Su stayed in the princess's quarters, calm and composed, while I lingered in the courtyard, exchanging whispers with the other ghosts. Some shared tales of lives cruelly stolen, their hatred for the princess palpable. Yet, as time passed and her murderous habits seemed to fade, a few spirits decided to abandon their grievances and seek reincarnation. Still, others remained, vowing to exact justice for their suffering. One elderly ghost, her translucent form more defined than the rest, suddenly stopped mid-conversation. Her gaze locked on the princess's chambers. "Something's wrong," she murmured. "The barrier, it's weakening." A ripple of unease spread through the gathered spirits. Without hesitation, the vengeful ghosts surged toward the princess's quarters. Fear gripped me as I followed. If the barrier truly had weakened, chaos was imminent. Worse, Song Su might become collateral damage. Inside the room, the princess leaned against Song Su, her face pale and weary. "I had another nightmare," she murmured, her voice trembling. The faint glow of the protective barrier still surrounded her, but its light was dimmer than before. I floated closer, reaching out tentatively toward the flickering barrier. Before I could touch it, Song Su's eyes lifted, locking directly onto mine. "Yun Yang," he said softly. I froze, my ghostly hands suspended midair. His voice was so familiar, so gentle, that for a moment, I forgot everything else. The princess frowned, confused. "What did you say?" Song Su turned to her with a serene smile. "Your Highness, it's time." Before she could react, he raised his hand and pressed a single finger to her forehead. The barrier shattered instantly, the faint blue glow extinguished. The princess's eyes widened in terror, and a piercing scream tore from her throat. The ghosts descended upon her in an instant, their forms clawing and swirling around her. She vanished beneath the writhing mass of vengeful spirits. I stood frozen, unable to move, as Song Su walked calmly through the chaos and stopped before me. The moonlight reflected in his eyes as he smiled gently. "Yun Yang, didn't you say you wanted to be a princess in your next life?" That night, beneath the full moon, the princess's soul was forcibly torn from her body. In that instant, a powerful force gripped me, pulling me into her vacant vessel. When I awoke, 3 days had passed. The room was quiet, devoid of ghosts or lingering shadows. Only Song Su remained, seated beside me. His expression was soft, tender, as though nothing had ever changed. I raised a trembling hand to his face, brushing my fingers against his cheek. The warmth of his skin felt so real, so alive, that I couldn't stop the tears from spilling down my face. "Did you plan this all along?" I whispered. Song Su nodded. He explained everything, the fabricated nightmares that drew him to the sorcerer, the intricate plan to weaken the princess's barrier, and the secret he had kept even as he buried my head. Every step had been carefully calculated to ensure that my soul would take the princess's place. "Yun Yang," he said softly, his gaze unwavering, "this body, this life, it was always meant for you. Tears blurred my vision as I listened to him recount how he had mixed spirit-severing medicine into the princess's daily tonics. How he had ensured that her body would be strong enough to house my soul while her spirit was cast out. She deserves everything you endured, he murmured, his voice laced with quiet anger. What happened to the ghosts? I asked, my voice barely audible. They left, he said. Once they saw the princess receive her punishment, they let go of their hatred and moved on. And the princess? I hesitated, dreading the answer. She's gone to face the torment she inflicted on you, many times over, he said simply. For a moment, silence stretched between us. Then, as though sensing my unease, Song-Su reached out and took my hand in his. Yun-Yang, this is our second chance. Let's live it well. His words held a promise that felt like sunlight after a long, dark storm. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of happiness once more. When they asked me about my plans, I laughed bitterly. Of course I want to reincarnate, but I can't leave. The ghosts chattered, debating the cause. Some said I must have unfinished business, others teased that I was too attached to Song-Su. I shrugged, unwilling to argue either point. As we spoke, the eldest among us, a ghostly woman who had lingered the longest, suddenly froze, her eyes fixed on the direction of the princess's room. The barrier, she whispered, it's weakening. The others bolted toward the room like a flood, their energy surging. My heart dropped as I followed. If the barrier truly broke, chaos would erupt, and Song-Su might be caught in the crossfire. When I entered the room, I saw the princess leaning against Song-Su, her face pale with fright. She mumbled something about a nightmare. The barrier was still present, but its light was dimmer than before. I reached out to touch it, only for Song-Su to suddenly lift his gaze. His eyes locked on me with unsettling precision. Yun-Yang, he said, softly but unmistakably, addressing me by name. I froze, my hand hovering midair. The princess blinked in surprise. What did you say? Turning to her, Song-Su offered a serene smile. Your Highness, it's time. He raised a hand and gently touched her forehead. In an instant, the blue light surrounding her vanished. The princess let out a blood-curdling scream, sharp enough to pierce the night. Her barrier was gone. The ghosts cackled gleefully as they surged toward her, engulfing her completely. I stood rooted to the spot, watching in stunned silence as Song-Su walked calmly through the throng, his eyes fixed on me. His gaze was as clear as the moonlight reflecting in his pupils. Yun-Yang, he murmured, his voice soft and certain, didn't you say you wanted to be a princess in your next life? On the night of the full moon, the ghosts dragged the princess's soul out of her body. At the same time, an immense force pulled me forward. When I opened my eyes again, 3 days had passed. The room was silent. No ghosts, no princess, just Song-Su, sitting by the bedside. He smiled at me, the same warm, gentle smile I remembered from before. I reached out tentatively, brushing my fingers against his face. The warmth of his skin startled me, and before I knew it, tears streamed down my cheeks. You planned this all along, didn't you? I whispered. He nodded. Then he explained everything. The nightmares he claimed to suffer in the borderlands had been a lie, but his encounter with a Western sorcerer was real. After saving the sorcerer's life, Song-Su had been taught his secrets. He knew the princess would retaliate against him, but he hadn't expected her to kill me. When he buried me, he placed a soul-locking talisman inside his jade pendant and buried it alongside me, ensuring my spirit would remain with him. Yun-Yang, he said softly, I decided long ago that this body would be yours. The medicines he had painstakingly prepared for the princess contained not just tonics for her health but also ingredients for the soul separation elixir. On the night of the full moon, when the barrier was broken and the ghosts overwhelmed her, her spirit was finally weak enough for me to take her place. What about the princess? I asked, though it wasn't her fate that concerned me. I worried about the other ghosts, the innocents who had suffered under her. Were they able to reincarnate? They let go of their resentment after seeing her punished, Song-Su replied, his voice gentle. They've all left. As for the princess, she'll endure everything you suffered, and only then will she move on. As he spoke, a pale blue light emerged from his sleeve. Within it, I saw the princess's soul, charred, twisted, and grotesque. She glared at me with pure hatred. Yun-Yang, she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous, don't think you've won just because you've taken my body. I've already sent a dream to my father, he'll come for me, and you'll both pay. I ignored her outburst, crossing my arms and turning to Song-Su. Why couldn't I send dreams when I was a ghost? He shrugged innocently. Because I locked your soul with the talisman. You couldn't do anything. Unbelievable. I growled, reaching out to pinch his face. He let me, his lips curving into a tender smile, as warm and gentle as a spring breeze. The princess hovered furiously nearby, her ghostly form flickering with rage. Suddenly, a guard burst into the room, out of breath. "Your Majesty has arrived," he announced. The princess's eyes lit up with triumph. "Father is here. You're both finished." My heart skipped a beat. Quickly composing myself, I grabbed Song Su's wrist and said, "The Emperor is here. Let's go greet him together." The Emperor entered the grand hall, his expression dark and stormy. I hurried forward, looping my arm through his and tilting my head up with a sweet smile. "Father, what brings you here in person?" The Emperor's frown deepened as he studied me. "Last night, I dreamed of you. You said Song Su was plotting against you and begged me to save you." I stifled a chuckle. "Father, I know you must have had that dream because you care so deeply for me. But look," I stepped back, twirling gracefully as the hem of my skirt flared around me. "I'm standing here, perfectly fine." The Emperor's stern expression softened slightly, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. Taking his arm again, I rested my head against his shoulder. "Father, my wedding day is fast approaching. Perhaps your dream was simply a sign that you're reluctant to let me go." To distract him, I added playfully, "Do you remember when I was little, how you never let me eat candied hawthorn? Today, won't you make an exception for your daughter?" Hearing me reminisce, the Emperor's features finally relaxed into a faint smile. He reached out to tap my forehead lightly. "You little rascal. Even as a child, you always craved the simplest things, just like the common folk. Very well, if you want candied hawthorn, I'll have the palace chefs make it and send it to you. Will that do? Father, you're the best." I nuzzled his arm affectionately, eliciting a warm laugh. Glancing over my shoulder, I stuck my tongue out at the princess's direction. "Who says I can't charm my way out of this too?" The princess's fury reached its peak. With an ear-splitting shriek, her scorched figure manifested in the air. The Emperor recoiled, his eyes wide with terror. "Song Su," he bellowed. "There's a ghost. Get rid of it, now." The princess, hearing his words, was overcome with blind rage. She lunged toward me with her clawed hands. I instinctively moved to dodge, but the Emperor stepped in front of me, shielding me with his body. Her vengeful strike landed squarely on his chest. "Father!" I cried, rushing to catch him as he collapsed. His face turned ashen, and within moments, he was gone. The princess hesitated for a fleeting moment, but her wrath quickly reignited. With a guttural howl, she hurled herself at me again. Before she could reach me, Song Su stepped forward, his movements swift and decisive. He raised his hand and struck her with a powerful blow. Her twisted soul screamed in agony, shattering into nothingness before she could utter another word. After the Emperor's death, the crown prince ascended to the throne. Known for his righteousness, the new emperor had long despised the princess's tyranny. Calls to strip her of her title echoed across the court, but by the time his officials arrived at her estate, it was deserted. That very night, Song Su and I packed the princess's treasures and slipped out of the capital. We traveled south, eventually settling in a small, picturesque town where the weather was warm and the seasons gentle. There, we purchased a modest yet charming home to start anew. On the day the property changed hands, Song Su claimed he had errands to run, leaving me to inspect the house alone. Grumbling under my breath, I took a carriage to the address. But as I stepped down, I froze in shock. Standing before the sturdy wooden gate were my parents. Dressed in fine clothes, they smiled at me with warm, welcoming expressions. "Yun Yang," my mother called softly. "You're home." Tears blurred my vision as I ran into their embrace, clutching them tightly. At that moment, all the pain and sorrow I had endured seemed to melt away. Song Su emerged from the house, his expression gentle, his smile impossibly warm. I suddenly remembered his promises. "I'll build a new house and bring your parents to the city. I'll make sure you live a better life. And I'll grow old with you." He had kept every single one of them. The end.